Hello there, my fellow mythology lovers. Welcome to Mythologist Sleepy's YouTube channel. Tonight's story is going to be about the Olympics. For those of you who do not know, the Olympic Games are the oldest continuous cultural tradition in human history. They began not as a sporting event, but as a sacred ritual, a religious festival held in honour of Zeus, the king of the gods, in a rural sanctuary called Olympia in ancient Greece. For over 1,000 years, athletes competed naked, not for gold medals or money, but for a simple crown woven from the branches of a sacred olive tree. They swore oaths on the blood of sacrificed animals. They raced barefoot in the dust. They fought with their fists wrapped in leather, sometimes to the death. And they did it all because they believed the gods were watching. The Olympics were never just about sport. They were about immortality. In ancient Greece, physical death was inevitable, but fame, kleos, could make a man live forever. A victor's name would be carved in stone, sung by poets, remembered for generations. To win at Olympia was to transcend mortality, to become something more than human. And that belief, that hunger for glory, for meaning, for something greater than ourselves, it has never gone away. The games were abolished in 393 AD by a Christian emperor who saw them as pagan idolatry. The temples crumbled. The stadium was buried beneath mud and sediment. For 1,500 years, the Olympics were nothing but a legend, a memory whispered in the ruins of a forgotten world. But in 1896, they were reborn, not as a religious festival, but as a symbol of international peace and human excellence. And since then, they have become the most watched event on Earth. They have survived 2 world wars, political boycotts, acts of terror, and scandals that threaten to destroy them. They have been a stage for heroes and a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest conflicts. Tonight, you will journey through the full story of the Olympic Games, from the myths of gods and heroes who founded them, to the brutal reality of ancient competition, to the modern athletes who push the limits of what the human body can achieve. You will meet Heracles, who paced out the length of the stadium and planted the sacred olive tree. And you will discover that the Olympics are not just about winning, they are about the eternal human need to strive, to compete, to reach for something beyond ourselves. But before we travel back to ancient Greece, I want to show you why this story still matters today. Because on February 12th, 2026, something extraordinary happened. The ice was silent. 20,000 spectators held their breath in the Milano Cortina Olympic Arena as a 20-year-old skater from Oakland, California, stepped onto the frozen stage. The lights dimmed. The world narrowed to a single point. A young woman in a glittering costume standing alone on a sheet of ice that reflected the glow of 1 billion screens watching from every corner of the earth. Her name was Elisa Liu, and the world was watching her return from the dead. 3 years earlier, at just 16 years old, Liu had walked away from competitive figure skating. She'd been a prodigy, the youngest woman in history to land a triple axel in international competition at age 12, the youngest US women's figure skating champion at 13. But by 16, after the 2022 Beijing Olympics, she was exhausted, burned out. She retired. She needed to breathe. But in March 2024, something changed. After discovering joy in skiing, the same exhaustion, the same leg strain, the same rush of pushing her body to its limits, she realized she still loved the feeling, not the pressure, not the expectations, but the art, the movement, the expression. She came back, not for coaches, not for sponsors, not for anyone but herself. And on that night in February 2026, in front of billions watching around the world, Elisa Liu delivered a flawless free skate, triple flip, triple Lutz triple toe loop combination, signature artistry that made the ice look like water, her body like wind. She scored 150.20 points in the free skate, a personal best. Combined with her short program, Her total of 226.79 points secured the gold medal. It was the first Olympic gold in women's figure skating for the United States in 24 years. When reporters asked her about the pressure, she smiled and said, "You'd have to explain Olympic pressure to me. I don't feel like my life is on the line anymore. I skate now to show my art." In that moment, Elisa Liu became more than a champion. She became a symbol of something ancient, something that stretches back thousands of years, from the dusty fields of ancient Greece to the gleaming ice rinks of the modern world. She became a living embodiment of what the Olympics have always been about: human beings pushing beyond what seems possible, not for survival, but for glory, for expression. And that is where our story begins. But before I move on, if you're truly enjoying these videos, please feel free to hit that subscribe button and give this video a quick thumbs up. If you have any topic suggestions or requests for future episodes, drop them in the comments below. Now settle in. We're travelling back over 2,700 years, to a dusty field in rural Greece, to a sanctuary where the gods themselves were said to watch mortals compete for glory. We're going to meet the heroes who founded the games, the athletes who bled for immortality, and the forces that brought the ancient tradition to its knees. If you had asked an ancient Greek where the Olympic Games came from, they would not have pointed to a date or a historical document. They would have told you a story. Because to the Greeks, history and myth were not separate things. They were woven together like threads in a tapestry, each giving meaning to the other. The games, they believed, were not invented by mortals. They were a gift from the gods, or perhaps a challenge issued by heroes who walked the line between the human and the divine. And depending on which city-state you asked, you would hear different versions of the same truth: that the Olympics were born from blood, from ambition, from the need to honour something greater than oneself. There are two myths that stand above all others when it comes to the founding of the Games. Two stories that the ancient Greeks told and retold, each one revealing something essential about what the Olympics meant to them. The first is the story of Heracles, the greatest hero who ever lived. The second is the story of Pelops, a prince who won a bride through treachery and established the Games to atone for his crime. Let us begin with Heracles. Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. From the moment of his birth, he was marked for greatness and suffering in equal measure. Hera, the queen of the gods and Zeus's jealous wife, hated Heracles for being a living reminder of her husband's infidelity. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, but the infant Heracles strangled them with his bare hands. As a man, Heracles was unmatched in strength, courage, and skill. But Hera's hatred never faded. She drove him mad, and in his madness, Heracles killed his own wife and children. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, he was consumed by grief and guilt. To atone for his crime, Heracles was commanded to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and complete 12 impossible labours, tasks so dangerous that no mortal man could hope to survive them. He strangled the Nemean lion with his bare hands, he slayed the 9-headed Hydra, he captured the golden hind of Artemis and the Erymanthian boar, he drove away the Stymphalian birds and captured the Cretan bull. But it was the 5th labour that brought him to the region of Elis, to the kingdom of King Augeas. King Augeas owned the largest herds of cattle in all of Greece, over 3,000 head of livestock. Their stables had not been cleaned in 30 years. The filth was so deep, so foul, that it had become a pestilence, poisoning the land and the rivers. Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean the Augean stables in a single day. It was meant to be a humiliation, an impossible task designed to break the hero's spirit. But Heracles did not despair. He studied the land. He observed the 2 rivers that flowed nearby, the Alpheus and the Peneus. And then, with his bare hands and a lever made from a tree trunk, he tore down the walls of the stables and diverted both rivers through the filth. In a single day, the waters of the Alpheus and Peneus swept away 30 years of decay. When the task was complete, Heracles stood in the valley of Olympia, surrounded by the clean, sacred land. The rivers had purified the earth. The air was fresh. The sun shone down on the valley like a blessing, and in that moment Heracles decided to honour his father, Zeus, the king of the gods. He paced out the length of a stadium by walking 600 steps heel to toe, establishing the distance of the stadion race, approximately 192 metres. He marked the boundaries with stones. He planted a sacred olive tree, brought from the land of the Hyperboreans at the edge of the world, and declared that victors of the games would be crowned with its branches. He gathered athletes from across Greece and held the first Olympic Games in honour of Zeus. The games, according to this myth, were an act of worship, a way for mortals to prove their excellence in the eyes of the divine. Heracles established the tradition of the Equestrian, the Olympic truce, which forbade all warfare during the festival and guaranteed safe passage for athletes and spectators. It was a sacred peace, enforced not by armies but by the will of the gods. And so, every 4 years, athletes would gather at Olympia to compete in the shadow of Zeus, to honour the hero who had purified the land and made it holy. But there is another story, a darker one, the Pelops origin myth. In the region of Pisa, near Olympia, there ruled a king named Oenomaus. He was a proud and violent man, and he had a daughter named Hippodamia, whose beauty was said to rival that of the goddesses themselves. An oracle had warned Oenomaus that he would be killed by his son-in-law, and so, to prevent his own death, Oenomaus devised a cruel test for any man who sought to marry his daughter. He challenged each suitor to a chariot race. The suitor would be given a head start, and Oenomaus would pursue him in his own chariot, which was pulled by divine horses given to him by Ares, the god of war. If the suitor reached the finish line, he would win Hippodamia's hand. But if Oenomaus caught him, and he always did, the suitor would be killed, and his head would be nailed to the palace walls as a warning to others. 13 men had already died. Then came Pelops, a prince from Asia Minor, the son of King Tantalus. Pelops was young, ambitious, and desperate to prove himself. He had heard of Hippodamia's beauty and of the deadly race, and he was determined to win. But Pelops was not a fool. He knew he could not defeat Oenomaus in a fair race. The king's horses were too fast, his chariot too strong, and so Pelops turned to treachery. He approached Myrtilus, the king's charioteer, and made him an offer. Sabotaged the king's chariot, and in return Pelops would give him half the kingdom and the first night with Hippodamia. Myrtilus, who was in love with Hippodamia himself and bitter over his lowly station, agreed. On the day of the race, Myrtilus replaced the bronze linchpins that held the wheels of Oenomaus' chariot with pins made of wax. The race began. Pelops took the lead. Oenomaus pursued, his divine horses thundering across the earth, closing the distance with terrifying speed. But as Oenomaus' chariot rounded a sharp turn, the wax melted. The wheels flew off. The chariot disintegrated. Oenomaus was thrown from the wreckage and dragged to death by his own horses, his body torn apart on the stones. Pelops had won. He married Hippodamia and claimed the kingdom. But the victory was stained with blood and betrayal. And when Myrtilus came to claim his reward, half the kingdom and the first night with the bride, Pelops refused. Instead, he threw Myrtilus from a cliff into the sea. As Myrtilus fell, he cursed Pelops and all his descendants. That curse would echo through generations, bringing madness, murder, and tragedy to the house of Atreus, the bloodline that would produce Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and Orestes. But Pelops, haunted by guilt and the weight of the curse, sought to atone. He established funeral games in honour of Oenomaus to honour the dead king and appease the gods. These games, held at Olympia, became a sacred tradition, a way to transform violence into ritual, bloodshed into competition. The entire region was named after him, the Peloponnese, the island of Pelops. And so, according to this myth, the Olympic Games were born not from purity, but from treachery and atonement. They were a way to honour the dead, to cleanse the land of blood, and to turn the chaos of violence into the order of sacred competition. Whether you believe the story of Heracles or the story of Pelops, One thing was certain. Olympia was a holy place. It was not a city. It was a sanctuary, a sacred grove nestled in the valley where the Alpheus and Cladius rivers met. The land was dedicated entirely to Zeus, and no one lived there permanently except for the priests and caretakers who maintained the temples. At the heart of the sanctuary stood the Temple of Zeus, one of the greatest structures in all of Greece. Inside the temple was a statue of Zeus so magnificent that it was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The statue stood over 40 feet tall, crafted by the sculptor Phidias from gold and ivory. Zeus sat on a throne, holding a scepter in one hand and a statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, in the other. His eyes were made of precious stones, and they seemed to gaze down on all who entered with a mixture of judgment and grace. Beside the temple was the Altis, the sacred grove, where the ancient olive tree planted by Heracles still grew. Every 4 years, a boy whose parents were both still living would cut branches from the tree with a golden sickle, and those branches would be woven into crowns for the victors. And towering above it all was the altar of Zeus, a massive mound built not from stone, but from the ashes of sacrifices. For over 1,000 years, animals were slaughtered and burned in honour of Zeus, and their ashes were piled onto the altar. By the time the games ended in 393 AD, the altar stood over 20 feet high, a monument built from devotion, blood, and fire. This was Olympia. This was where mortals came to prove themselves worthy in the eyes of the gods. But the games were not open to everyone who could compete. The ancient Olympic Games were exclusive in ways that would be unthinkable today. Only freeborn Greek men who spoke Greek were allowed to compete. No slaves, no foreigners, no women. Married women were forbidden from even attending the games as spectators, on penalty of death. According to the law, any married woman caught watching the Olympics would be thrown from Mount Typeum, a cliff near Olympia. There is no record of this punishment ever being carried out, but the threat was real enough to keep women away. The only exceptions were unmarried women, priestesses of Demeter, and curiously prostitutes. But the exclusion of women from the main games did not mean they had no place in the Olympic tradition. Unmarried women had their own festival, the Heraean Games, dedicated to Hera, the queen of the gods and wife of Zeus. These games were held at Olympia, on the same track as the men's events, though the distance was shortened by 1/6. Young women competed in foot races, wearing short tunics that left the right shoulder and breast bare. Winners received crowns of olive leaves and a portion of a cow sacrificed to Hera. They were also allowed to dedicate statues of themselves at the temple of Hera, an honour that granted them a form of immortality. Some scholars believe the Heraean Games were even older than the Olympic Games, dating back to pre-Greek civilizations that worshipped the great goddess. But for the men who competed in the main games, the stakes were far higher. The myths had been told. The sacred ground had been consecrated. The rules had been established. But myths are one thing, history is another. In 776 BC, the first Olympic Games were recorded in history. A man named Coroebus, a cook from the city of Elis, won the stadion race. His name was inscribed on a tablet, and he became the first mortal to achieve Olympic immortality. But what were these games really like? What did it mean to compete at Olympia? What rituals did the athletes perform? What oaths did they swear? And most importantly, what kind of men were willing to risk everything for a crown of leaves? The year is 776 BC. The summer sun blazes over the valley of Olympia. The air shimmers with heat. Dust rises from the roads as men arrive from every corner of the Greek world. Athletes, trainers, spectators, merchants, poets, and priests. They come from Athens and Sparta, from Corinth and Thebes, from the islands of the Aegean and the colonies of Sicily and southern Italy. They come because the heralds have declared the Equestrian, the Olympic truce. For 1 month all wars must cease, all hostilities must be suspended, Any man who violates the truce will be fined, banned from the games, and cursed by the gods. This is not merely a sporting event. This is a sacred festival, a pilgrimage, a gathering of the Greek world in honour of Zeus, the king of the gods. And at the centre of it all is a single race, a sprint of 192 metres, the length of the stadium. The winner's name will be inscribed in stone. He will be remembered forever. His name is Coroebus. He is a cook from the city of Elis, and he is about to become the first Olympic champion in recorded history, the Olympic truce, Equestrian. Before we can understand the games themselves, we must understand the truce that made them possible. Ancient Greece was not a unified nation. It was a collection of independent city-states, polis, that were constantly at war with one another. Athens fought Sparta. Corinth fought Thebes. Alliances shifted. Borders changed. Blood was spilled over trade routes, territorial disputes, and matters of honour. But every 4 years, all of that stopped. The Olympic truce, or Equestrian, was a sacred peace declared by the city of Elis, which controlled the sanctuary of Olympia. 3 heralds, known as theoroi, were sent out across the Greek world. They carried staffs and wore crowns of olive leaves, symbols of their sacred mission. They travelled to every major city and proclaimed the truce. The terms were simple. All wars must cease for the duration of the festival. All armies must withdraw from the territory of Elis. All athletes, trainers, officials and spectators must be granted safe passage to and from Olympia. Any city-state that violated the truce would be fined heavily and banned from the games. The fine was not paid in gold or silver, but in mini, a unit of weight equivalent to about 100 drachmas. For a small city, the fine could be crippling. But more than the financial penalty, violating the truce was considered an offence against Zeus himself. It was sacrilege. It invited the wrath of the gods. And so, for over 1,000 years, the truce held. Even during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens and Sparta were locked in a brutal conflict that would last nearly 3 decades, the Olympic Games continued. Soldiers laid down their weapons. Generals became spectators. Enemies sat side by side in the stadium, united by their shared reverence for the gods and their love of competition. The Equestrian is considered one of the longest-lasting peace accords in human history. It was not enforced by armies or treaties, but by faith, by the belief that some things are more sacred than war. The sacred oath. Once the athletes arrived at Olympia, they did not immediately compete. First, they had to prove themselves worthy. For 10 months before the games, athletes were required to train. They had to swear before their local officials that they had completed this training. Only then were they allowed to travel to Olympia. Upon arrival, athletes spent 30 days training under the supervision of the Hellanodikai, the judges of the games. These judges were chosen from the citizens of Elis and were considered incorruptible. They wore purple robes and carried staffs, symbols of their authority. The judges observed the athletes, evaluated their skills, and determined which events they were qualified to enter. They also enforced the rules and had the power to disqualify or punish anyone who broke them. But before any competition could begin, there was one final ritual. On the day before the games officially started, all athletes and their trainers gathered in the Bouleuterion, the council house at Olympia. In the centre of the room stood a statue of Zeus Horkios, Zeus the Oath-keeper. The statue was terrifying. Zeus held thunderbolts in both hands, his face frozen in an expression of divine wrath. At the feet of the statue, a boar was sacrificed. Its throat was cut and its blood pooled on the ground. One by one, the athletes stepped forward. They placed their hands on the bloody entrails of the boar and swore an oath. I swear by Zeus, by Apollo, and by all the gods that I have trained for 10 months, that I will compete fairly and honourably, that I will not cheat or use foul play, and that I will uphold the sacred traditions of the games. The trainers and fathers of the athletes swore a similar oath, promising that they had prepared their athletes properly and would not interfere with the competition. The judges also swore an oath to be fair, impartial, and to keep secret anything they learned about the athletes during training. Breaking any of these oaths was not just a violation of the rules, it was a crime against the gods, and the punishment was severe. Cheating at the ancient Olympics was rare, but it did happen. Athletes who were caught bribing opponents, using foul play or breaking the rules were fined heavily. The fines were used to commission bronze statues of Zeus, known as Zanes. These statues were placed at the entrance to the stadium, where every athlete had to pass them on the way to compete. Each statue bore an inscription with the name of the cheater, his city, and his crime. The message was clear: this man dishonoured the gods. Do not be like him. By the end of the ancient games, there were 16 Zanes lining the entrance to the stadium, a hall of shame that served as a warning to future generations. But for most athletes, the oath was enough. The fear of divine punishment, the shame of dishonouring their city, and the desire for true glory kept them honest. Because the prize at Olympia was not wealth. It was immortality, the hecatomb, sacrifice of 100 oxen. The Olympic Games were not just athletic competitions, they were religious festivals, and at the heart of every religious festival was sacrifice. On the third day of the Games, the most important ritual took place, the hecatomb, the sacrifice of 100 oxen in honour of Zeus. The oxen were led in a grand procession from the Altis to the altar of Zeus. Priests chanted hymns, musicians played flutes and lyres. The crowd watched in reverent silence. At the altar, the oxen were slaughtered one by one. Their throats were cut, and their blood was poured onto the altar as an offering to Zeus. The meat was butchered and distributed to the athletes and spectators, one of the few times in ancient Greece when ordinary people could afford to eat meat. But the fat and bones were burned. The smoke rose into the sky, carrying the offering to the gods. The ashes from the sacrifices were not swept away. They were piled onto the altar, building it higher with each Olympiad. Over the course of 1,000 years, the altar of Zeus grew into a massive mound, over 20 feet high, a monument built from devotion, blood and fire. This was the true heart of the Olympic Games. Not the races or the wrestling matches, but this moment when mortals offered the best of what they had to the gods, and the gods, in turn, blessed the competition. The ancient Olympic Games were not open to everyone. As we've already established, only freeborn Greek men who spoke Greek could compete. But the rules for spectators were almost as strict. Married women were forbidden from attending. The penalty, according to the law, was death. They were to be thrown from Mount Typeum. There is no record of this punishment ever being carried out, but the threat was real enough to keep married women away. The only women allowed to attend were unmarried women. The priestess of Demeter, who had a seat of honour in the stadium, prostitutes who were not considered respectable women and were therefore exempt from the ban. Why were married women banned? The reasons are unclear, but scholars have offered several theories. The athletes competed nude, and it was considered inappropriate for married women to see naked men who were not their husbands. The games were a religious festival for Zeus, and married women were associated with Hera, Zeus's wife. Allowing them to attend might have been seen as an insult to Hera. The games were a space for male bonding and competition, and the presence of women was seen as a distraction. Whatever the reason, the ban was strictly enforced, with one famous exception: the story of Calipatera. There is a story, recorded by the ancient writer Pausanias, of a woman named Calipatera who defied the ban. Calipatera was the daughter of a famous Olympic champion and the mother of a young athlete named Paisirodos. When her husband died, she took on the role of her son's trainer. She disguised herself as a man, wrapping her body in the robes of a male trainer, and accompanied her son to Olympia. Paisirodos competed in the boxing event, and won. Calipatera, overcome with joy, leaped over the barrier to embrace her son. In doing so, her robes came loose, and her disguise was revealed. She was immediately arrested. According to the law, she should have been thrown from Mount Typeum. But the judges faced a dilemma. Calipatera came from one of the most distinguished athletic families in Greece. Her father, her brothers, and now her son were all Olympic champions. To execute her would be to dishonour that legacy. The judges decided to spare her life, but from that day forward, a new rule was established. All trainers, like the athletes, had to enter the stadium completely nude. This ensured that no woman could ever disguise herself again. The Women's Games, the Heraean Games. While married women were banned from the main Olympic Games, unmarried women had their own festival, the Heraean Games, dedicated to Hera, the Queen of the Gods. The Heraean Games were held at Olympia, on the same track as the men's events, though the distance was shortened by 1/6, approximately 160 metres instead of 192. Young women competed in foot races, wearing short tunics called chitons that left the right shoulder and breast bare. Their hair was worn loose, flowing behind them as they ran. Winners received crowns of olive leaves, just like the male champions. They were also given a portion of a cow that had been sacrificed to Hera, and they were allowed to dedicate statues of themselves at the Temple of Hera. Some scholars believe the Heraean Games were even older than the Olympic Games, dating back to pre-Greek civilizations that worshipped a great goddess figure. If this is true, then the Women's Games may represent the survival of an ancient matriarchal tradition within the patriarchal structure of classical Greece. The oaths had been sworn, the sacrifices had been made, the sacred rituals had been performed. Now, finally, the competition could begin. But what were these events? What did it mean to compete at Olympia? What kind of men were willing to run barefoot in the blazing sun, to fight with their fists wrapped in leather, to risk broken bones and even death? All for a crown of leaves? And what made a champion? What separated the victors from the defeated? To answer these questions, we must step into the stadium itself. We must feel the dust beneath our feet, hear the roar of the crowd, and witness the brutal, beautiful reality of ancient athletic competition. The stadium at Olympia could hold 40,000 spectators. There were no seats, just a long earthen embankment carved into the hillside, where men sat shoulder to shoulder in the blazing Greek sun. The heat was merciless. The air shimmered. Dust hung in the atmosphere like a veil. And in the centre of it all, on a track of hard-packed earth, stood the athletes, naked, oiled, and ready to compete for a glory that would outlive their bodies. To understand the ancient Olympic Games, you must first understand this. The athletes competed completely nude. The Greek word for naked is gymnos, from which we get the word gymnasium. Nudity was not considered shameful or obscene. It was sacred. The human body, in Greek thought, was a reflection of divine perfection. To compete nude was to honour the gods by displaying the beauty and strength they had given to mortals. It was also a matter of fairness. With no clothing, there could be no hidden advantages, no tricks, no deception. Every athlete stood equal before the gods and before each other, with nothing but their own flesh, muscle, and will. According to legend, the tradition of nudity became mandatory after a runner named Orsippus of Megara competed in the Stadion race around 720 BC. His loincloth came loose during the race, and he tripped and fell. But instead of stopping, he tore the cloth away and continued running, and won. From that day forward, all athletes competed naked, and Orsippus was remembered not just as champion, but as the man who established one of the most iconic traditions of the ancient games. Whether this story is true or merely a myth invented to explain the practice, we cannot know. But what is certain is that for over 1,000 years, every athlete who stepped onto the track at Olympia did so with nothing to hide. Before competing, athletes rubbed their bodies with olive oil. This served several purposes. It protected the skin from the sun and made the body glisten in the light, emphasizing the definition of muscles and the grace of movement. It also made it harder for opponents to grip during wrestling and pancration. After training or competition, athletes used a tool called a strigil, a curved bronze scraper, to remove the oil, sweat, and dust from their skin. The mixture that came off was considered valuable. It was collected and sold as a kind of medicinal ointment. believed to have healing properties because it had touched the bodies of champions. The events of the ancient Olympics were divided into 3 categories: running, combat sports, and equestrian events. Each one tested a different aspect of human excellence: speed, strength, endurance, courage, and skill. And each one carried the possibility of injury, humiliation, or death. The athletes who competed were not professionals in the modern sense. They did not receive salaries or sponsorships. They were aristocrats, farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen who trained for months or years, driven by a hunger for glory that transcended wealth or comfort. To win at Olympia was to achieve kleos, eternal fame. To lose was to return home in shame, a forgotten name in a world that worshipped victors. The oldest and most prestigious event was the Stadion, a sprint of approximately 192 metres, the length of the stadium. This was the race that Coroebus won in 776 BC, the race that marked the beginning of recorded Olympic history. The runners lined up at a stone starting line called the balbis, which had grooves carved into it for their toes to grip. A rope was stretched across the track in front of them, held by officials. When the signal was given, a trumpet blast or a shout, the rope was dropped and the runners exploded forward. There were no lanes, no rules about staying in your position. Athletes could jostle, elbow, and shove each other as they sprinted toward the finish line. The race was over in less than 30 seconds, but in that brief span of time, a man could become immortal. The Diolos was a double stadion race, approximately 400 metres. Runners sprinted down the length of the track, rounded a post at the far end, and sprinted back. The turn was chaotic and dangerous. Athletes collided, stumbled, and fought for position. The Dolichos was the long-distance race, ranging from 7 to 24 laps of the stadium depending on the era. It was a test of endurance, run in the full heat of the Greek summer. Runners gasped for air, their lungs burning, their legs trembling, as the crowd roared and the sun beat down without mercy. And then there was the hoplitodromos, the armed race, which was added to the games in 520 BC. Athletes ran 2 lengths of the stadium wearing a full bronze helmet and carrying a heavy shield. The sight of naked men sprinting with shields clanging against their legs, stumbling and crashing into one another was both absurd and thrilling. It was a reminder that these games were not just about sport, they were about war, about the skills and courage that defined Greek manhood. But if the running events tested speed and endurance, the combat sports tested something darker, the willingness to inflict pain and to endure it. Wrestling, boxing, and pancration were not gentlemanly contests. They were brutal, bloody, and often deadly, and the crowds loved them. Wrestling or pale took place in a pit filled with soft sand called the scammer. The goal was simple: force your opponent to fall to the ground 3 times. Biting and eye gouging were forbidden, but almost everything else was allowed: throws, joint locks, choke holds, and strikes. Matches could last for hours, with both men drenched in sweat and covered in sand, their bodies locked in a struggle that was as much about willpower as it was about technique. There were no weight classes, no time limits, no rounds. You fought until one of you could no longer continue. Boxing, or pygmachia, was even more savage. Fighters wrapped their hands and knuckles in leather straps called himantes. In the early games, these straps were soft, designed to protect the hands, but over time, they evolved into weapons. By the Roman era, boxers wore cistus, leather straps reinforced with metal studs and spikes. Matches had no rounds, no breaks, no ring. 2 men stood face to face and struck each other until one of them surrendered by raising his hand, or until one of them was knocked unconscious. There were no rules about where you could hit. Fighters aimed for the face, the head, the throat. Noses were broken, teeth were shattered, ears were torn, blood poured into the sand. Death was not uncommon, and when it happened, it was considered an unfortunate but acceptable outcome. The victor was crowned, the loser was carried away, and then there was Pancration, the most brutal event of all. The name means all powers, or all strengths, and it was exactly that. A no-holds-barred combination of boxing, wrestling, kicking and ground fighting. Only two things were forbidden: biting and eye gouging. Everything else was legal. Fighters could punch, kick, elbow, knee, choke and break bones. They could slam their opponents into the ground, twist their limbs until they dislocated and crush their throats until they passed out. Submissions were common, so were serious injuries, and occasionally men died in the arena. One of the most famous stories from the ancient games is that of Heraean of Phigalia, who competed in the Pancration in 564 BC. During the final match, his opponent had him in a chokehold. Heraean was losing consciousness. His vision was fading, but in a final, desperate act, he twisted his body and dislocated his opponent's ankle. The pain was so intense that his opponent immediately raised his hand in submission. At the exact same moment, Heraean died. The judges declared him the victor. His corpse was crowned with the olive wreath, and his name was inscribed in stone as an Olympic champion. He had won immortality in the moment of his death. The equestrian events were held in the Hippodrome, a long narrow track outside the main stadium. Chariot racing was the most prestigious and dangerous of all Olympic events. 4-horse chariots, called tethripa, raced 12 laps around the Hippodrome, a distance of nearly 9 kilometres. The chariots were light, made of wood and leather, with no suspension and no safety features. The horses were powerful and fast, bred specifically for racing. The drivers, called charioteers, stood upright in the chariot, gripping the reins with both hands, their bodies exposed to every jolt and turn. The track was narrow, and crashes were frequent. Chariots collided, flipped and shattered. Horses stumbled and fell. Drivers were thrown from their chariots and trampled. The Greeks had a word for the chaos of the first turn in a chariot race, taraxippos, meaning horse disturber. It was believed that a malevolent spirit haunted that spot, causing horses to panic and drivers to lose control. But here is the strange thing. The victor of the chariot race was not the driver. It was the owner of the horses. Chariot racing was an aristocratic sport, affordable only to the wealthier citizens. The owners never set foot in the arena. They sat in the stands, watching as hired drivers risked their lives on their behalf. And when the race was over, it was the owner who received the olive crown, the owner whose name was inscribed in stone, the owner who was celebrated as a champion. This is how a woman named Caniska of Sparta became the first female Olympic victor. She was a princess, the daughter of King Archidamus II, and she owned and trained a team of horses that won the chariot race in 396 BC, and again in 392 BC. She never drove the chariot herself, but the victory was hers. She erected a statue of herself at Olympia with an inscription that read, "I am Caniska, and I declare that I alone of all the women of Greece have won this crown." It was a bold statement, a claim to glory in a world that sought to exclude her, and it worked. Her name has survived for over 2,000 years. But for every champion there were dozens of men who competed and lost, men who trained for years, who travelled across Greece, who swore oaths and made sacrifices, only to return home defeated. Some refused to enter their cities through the gates. They climbed over the walls instead, too ashamed to face their neighbours. Others were mocked in the streets, their failures immortalised in poems and songs. The ancient Greeks did not celebrate participation. They celebrated victory, and only victory. There were no silver or bronze medals, no consolation prizes. You either won or you were forgotten. And yet, despite the risk of humiliation, despite the possibility of injury or death, men continued to compete. Because the reward for victory was not wealth or comfort. It was something far more valuable. It was immortality. It was the knowledge that your name would be carved in stone, sung by poets, remembered for generations. It was the chance to transcend the limits of mortal life and become something greater. A hero, a legend, a man who had proven himself worthy in the eyes of the gods. And that, more than anything else, is what drove them. That is what made them willing to endure the heat, the pain, the blood, and the dust. That is what made them strip naked, step onto the track, and compete for a crown of leaves. Because in ancient Greece, glory was the only thing that mattered. And at Olympia, glory was within reach, if you were strong enough, fast enough, and brave enough to seize it. But what happened to those who won? What rewards awaited them when they returned home? What did it truly mean to be an Olympic champion? And how did a simple crown of olive leaves transform a mortal man into something immortal? The moment of victory at Olympia was unlike anything else in the ancient world. When an athlete crossed the finish line first, when a wrestler forced his opponent to submit, when a boxer stood alone while his rival lay unconscious in the sand, the stadium erupted. 40,000 voices roared as one. Spectators threw flowers, ribbons and branches onto the track. Friends and family members rushed forward to embrace the champion. Poets began composing verses in his honour before he had even caught his breath. And in that moment the athlete ceased to be an ordinary man. He became something more, a hero, a symbol, a living embodiment of human excellence. But the true reward was not the cheering crowd or the immediate celebration. The true reward came later, in the form of a simple crown and the immortality it represented. The only prize given at Olympia was a wreath woven from the branches of the sacred olive tree that Heracles himself was said to have planted. The tree grew in the Altis, the sacred grove at the heart of the sanctuary, and it was tended by priests who treated it with the reverence due to a living god. Every 4 years, on the final day of the games, a boy whose parents were both still living, a symbol of purity and good fortune, was chosen to cut branches from the tree using a golden sickle. The branches were then woven into crowns by the judges, and each crown was placed on the head of a victor during the closing ceremony. There were no gold medals, no silver or bronze. There was no money, no trophy, no tangible wealth. Just leaves. Just a crown that would wither and crumble within days. And yet, to the ancient Greeks, this crown was worth more than all the gold in the world, because it was not the physical object that mattered. It was what it represented. It represented the favour of the gods. It represented excellence, courage, and the triumph of the human spirit. And most importantly, it represented kleos, eternal glory, the kind of fame that would outlive the body and echo through the ages. When a champion returned to his home city, he was greeted as a hero. The entire city would turn out to welcome him. Processions were held in his honour, with musicians playing flutes and lyres, poets reciting verses, and citizens throwing flowers and olive branches in his path. In some cities, a section of the city wall was torn down so that the champion could enter through the breach, symbolising that a city with such a man had no need for walls. His strength and glory were defence enough. The champion was showered with rewards that far exceeded the simple olive crown he had won at Olympia. Many cities granted their Olympic victors saitsis, the right to free meals for life at public expense in the city hall or prytanion. This was an extraordinary honour, reserved for the most distinguished citizens, generals, statesmen, and now Olympic champions. The champion would eat alongside the city's leaders, a permanent guest of honour, his status elevated to that of a living legend. In addition to free meals, many cities awarded their champions substantial cash prizes. Athens, for example, gave 500 drachmas to an Olympic victor, a fortune equivalent to more than a year's wages for a skilled labourer. Sparta, which prided itself on austerity and discipline, gave no money, but granted its champions the honour of fighting beside the king in battle, a position of immense prestige and danger. Other cities exempted their champions from taxes, gave them front-row seats at theatres and public events, and granted them the right to erect statues of themselves in the city's most prominent locations. These statues were not mere decorations. They were monuments to immortality, physical representations of the champion's kleos. They stood in the agora, the central marketplace, where every citizen would see them daily. They stood at Olympia itself, in the sacred grove, where they would be seen by athletes and pilgrims for generations. The statues bore inscriptions with the champion's name, his city, and his event. Some included verses celebrating his victory. And as long as the statue stood, the champion's name would be remembered. He would live forever in stone. But perhaps the most powerful form of immortality came not from statues, but from poetry. The ancient Greeks believed that words had the power to transcend time in ways that even stone could not. A statue could be toppled, eroded, or destroyed. But a poem, once composed and performed, could be passed down through generations, sung at festivals, recited in schools, and preserved in the collective memory of the culture. This is why wealthy families commissioned famous poets to compose victory odes, or eponychia, in honour of their Olympic champions. The greatest of these poets was Pindar, who lived in the 5th century BC, and whose Olympian odes are considered some of the finest works of ancient Greek literature. Pindar's odes were not simple celebrations of athletic achievement. They were complex, layered works that connected the champion's victory to the myths of gods and heroes, elevating the athlete to a status approaching the divine. In one ode, Pindar compared an Olympic wrestler to Heracles himself, suggesting that the champion's strength and courage were gifts from the gods. In another, he described a victor's triumph as a moment when mortal excellence touched the realm of the immortal, when a man became, for an instant, something more than human. These odes were performed at public festivals, accompanied by music and dance. They were expensive. Pindar was paid enormous sums for his work, but they were worth it. Because a poem by Pindar did not just celebrate a victory. It ensured that the victory would never be forgotten. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, we still read Pindar's odes. We still know the names of the men he celebrated. And in that sense, those ancient athletes achieved exactly what they sought. They became immortal. Their bodies turned to dust centuries ago, but their names, their stories, and their glory remain. This is the power of kleos. This is what the ancient Greeks understood better than perhaps any culture before or since. That fame, not wealth or power, is the only thing that can truly outlast death. But not every athlete achieved this glory. For every champion, there were dozens of men who competed and lost. And in ancient Greece, losing was not met with sympathy or encouragement. It was met with shame. Athletes who returned home defeated were often mocked in the streets. Poets composed satirical verses about their failures. Some athletes refused to enter their cities through the main gates, choosing instead to climb over the walls under cover of darkness, too humiliated to face their neighbours. There were no participation trophies, no celebrations of effort or sportsmanship. The ancient Greeks did not value trying. They valued winning. Second place meant nothing. Third place meant nothing. If you did not win, you were forgotten. And for some athletes, that shame was unbearable. There are stories of defeated athletes who went into exile, who abandoned their families, who spent the rest of their lives wandering from city to city, unable to return to the place where they had once been celebrated as a promising competitor. The pressure to win was immense, and it drove some men to desperate measures. Cheating at the ancient Olympics was rare, but it did happen. Athletes who were caught bribing opponents, using foul play, or breaking the sacred oath they had sworn before Zeus were punished severely. The standard punishment was a heavy fine, paid not in coin but in the commissioning of a bronze statue of Zeus, known as a zane. These statues were placed at the entrance to the stadium, where every athlete had to pass them on the way to compete. Each statue bore an inscription with the name of the cheater, his city, and his crime. The inscriptions were blunt and unforgiving. One read, "An Olympic victory is to be won not by money, but by swiftness of foot and strength of body." Another declared, "This statue stands as a warning to all who would dishonour the gods." By the end of the ancient games, there were 16 zanes lining the entrance to the stadium, a hall of shame that served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of dishonour. For most athletes, the fear of having their name inscribed on one of these statues was enough to keep them honest. Because in ancient Greece, shame was worse than death. A man could die with honour and be remembered as a hero, but a man who cheated, who broke his oath to the gods, would be remembered forever as a coward and a liar. His name would become a curse, spoken with contempt by future generations. Yet despite the risks, the possibility of injury, humiliation or eternal shame, men continued to compete. They trained for years, endured brutal physical conditioning, travelled across Greece, and swore sacred oaths, all for the chance to win a crown of leaves. Why? Because the reward was not the crown itself. The reward was what the crown represented. It represented the approval of the gods. It represented the admiration of your peers. It represented the knowledge that you had pushed yourself to the absolute limit of human capability and emerged victorious. And most of all, it represented immortality, the chance to transcend the brief, fragile span of mortal life and become something eternal. In a world where death was inevitable and life was uncertain, where wars raged and plagues swept through cities, where even the greatest kings and warriors eventually turned to dust, Kleos was the only thing that could not be taken away. A man's wealth could be stolen, his power could be overthrown, his body would decay, but his name, if it was glorious enough, would live forever. And that is what the ancient Olympics offered. Not wealth, not comfort, not safety, but the chance to be remembered. The chance to become a legend, the chance to stand alongside the heroes of myth and be spoken of in the same breath as Heracles, Achilles, and Odysseus. And for 1,000 years, that was enough. For 1,000 years, men competed at Olympia, and the games endured. But all things, even the will of the gods, must eventually come to an end. And when the end came for the ancient Olympics, it came not from war or disaster, but from a shift in belief, a change in the very fabric of the world that made the Games possible. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games endured. They survived wars between city-states, invasions by foreign powers, and the rise and fall of empires. They continued through the conquests of Alexander the Great, through the expansion of the Roman Republic, and into the age of the Roman Empire. Athletes from across the Mediterranean world travelled to Olympia to compete. The sacred olive tree continued to grow. The altar of Zeus continued to rise, built higher with each sacrifice. The games seemed eternal, as permanent as the mountains that surrounded the valley, as unchanging as the gods themselves. But nothing in the mortal world lasts forever, and by the 4th century AD, the world that had created the Olympics was dying. The old gods were fading. A new faith was rising. And the games, which had been born from myth and ritual, would be destroyed by the same forces that had once sustained them: belief, power, and the will of emperors. The beginning of the end came not with a single decree, but with a gradual transformation. When Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BC, the Olympic Games did not stop. In fact, they continued much as they had for centuries. Roman aristocrats admired Greek culture and sought to associate themselves with its prestige. They sent athletes to compete. They attended the games as spectators. They commissioned statues and victory odes just as the Greeks had done. But the character of the games began to change. What had once been a sacred festival, a gathering of the Greek world in honour of Zeus, became a spectacle, a form of entertainment for a vast and diverse empire. The purity of the competition was compromised. Bribery became more common. wealthy Romans began to compete not because they had trained for years, but because they wanted the prestige of an Olympic victory, and in some cases they simply bought it. The most infamous example of this corruption came in 67 AD, when the Emperor Nero decided to compete in the Olympic Games. Nero fancied himself an artist, a musician, and an athlete, though he was none of these things. He was a vain, paranoid tyrant whose reign was marked by cruelty, excess, and delusion. But he was also the emperor, and no one dared to refuse him. Nero postponed the games by 2 years so that he could attend. He entered multiple events, including the chariot race, a singing competition, and an acting competition, the latter two of which he invented specifically for himself. In the chariot race, Nero drove a 10-horse chariot, an absurdly large and unwieldy vehicle that no skilled charioteer would ever use. Midway through the race, he fell out of the chariot and did not finish. But the judges, terrified of offending the emperor, declared him the winner anyway. They reasoned that he would have won if he had finished, and therefore he deserved the crown. Nero won every event he entered. He returned to Rome with 1,808 victory crowns, more than any athlete in history. He paraded through the streets in triumph, as if he had actually earned his victories through skill and effort. But everyone knew the truth, and after Nero's death in 68 AD, his victories were annulled. His name was erased from the Olympic records. The judges who had crowned him were disgraced. But the damage had been done. The games had been turned into a farce, a tool of imperial propaganda rather than a sacred ritual. Still, the games continued. Athletes still competed. Victors were still crowned. The rituals were still performed. But the world around Olympia was changing in ways that could not be ignored. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was in crisis. Barbarian tribes pressed against its borders. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for the throne. The economy collapsed. Plague swept through cities, killing millions, and in the midst of this chaos a new religion was spreading. A religion that rejected the old gods, that condemned the rituals and sacrifices that had sustained Greek and Roman culture for centuries. Christianity, which had begun as a small Jewish sect in the eastern provinces of the empire, was growing rapidly. Its followers believed in a single, all-powerful God who demanded exclusive worship. They rejected the pantheon of Greek and Roman gods as false idols, as demons masquerading as divine beings. They refused to participate in pagan rituals, refused to offer sacrifices, refused to honour the emperor as a god, and they were willing to die for these beliefs. For 3 centuries, Christians were persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and executed. But the faith did not die. It grew stronger, and in 312 AD, everything changed. The Emperor Constantine, facing a rival for the throne, claimed to have seen a vision of the Christian cross before a decisive battle. He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields, and he won. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian god, and he converted. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity and ended the persecutions. For the first time, Christians could worship openly, build churches, and hold positions of power. And within a few decades, Christianity went from being a persecuted minority to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The old gods, who had been worshipped for thousands of years, were suddenly seen as relics of a barbaric past. Temples were closed, sacrifices were banned, priests were driven out, and the Olympic Games, which had always been a religious festival dedicated to Zeus, found themselves in an impossible position. How could the games continue when the god they honoured was now considered a false idol? How could athletes swear oaths before a statue of Zeus when the empire's official religion declared that Zeus did not exist? The answer came in the form of a series of edicts issued by the Emperor Theodosius I, a devout Christian who ruled from 379 to 395 AD. Theodosius was determined to eradicate paganism from the empire. In 391 AD, he issued a decree banning all pagan sacrifices and closing all pagan temples. The decree did not specifically mention the Olympic Games, but it did not need to. The Games were fundamentally a religious festival. They began with sacrifices. They were held in honour of Zeus. They took place in a sanctuary filled with temples and altars dedicated to the old gods. Without the sacrifices, without the rituals, without the sacred purpose that had defined them for over 1,000 years, the Games could not continue. The popular story is that Theodosius banned the Olympics in 393 AD, but the truth is more complex. There is no surviving decree that explicitly abolishes the Games. What happened instead was a slow death. The sacrifices stopped, the priests left, the temples were closed, athletes stopped coming, and by the end of the 4th century the Olympic Games had simply ceased to exist. The last recorded Olympic victor was a man named Varus Dates, a prince from Armenia who won the boxing competition around 385 AD. His name was inscribed in stone, just as the names of champions had been inscribed for over 1,000 years. But after him, there were no more names, no more victors, no more crowns. The stadium at Olympia fell silent. The sacred olive tree withered. The altar of Zeus, which had been built from the ashes of sacrifices over the course of a millennium, stood abandoned. And then, in the centuries that followed, nature reclaimed the sanctuary. Earthquakes struck in 522 AD and 551 AD, toppling the temple of Zeus and shattering the great statue that had once been counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Cladeos River, which flowed near the sanctuary, changed course and flooded the site, burying the ruins under layers of mud and sediment. The stadium, the temples, the altars, the statues, all of it disappeared beneath the earth. For 1,500 years, Olympia was lost. The Olympic Games became a legend, a story told by scholars who read about them in ancient texts, but had never seen the place where they were held. The world moved on. New empires rose and fell. New religions spread. New forms of entertainment replaced the old. And the Games, which had once been the greatest celebration of human excellence in the ancient world, were forgotten. But legends do not die easily. And even as the physical site of Olympia lay buried and forgotten, the idea of the Games, the belief that competition could bring out the best in humanity, that athletic excellence was a form of worship, that glory was worth pursuing even at great cost, that idea survived. It survived in the writings of ancient historians and poets. It survived in the stories passed down through generations. It survived in the collective memory of Western civilization, waiting for the moment when it could be reborn. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe rediscovered its classical past, as archaeologists began to excavate the ruins of ancient Greece and Rome, the idea of the Olympics began to stir once more. Scholars read the accounts of Pausanias, the ancient travel writer who had described Olympia in meticulous detail. They read Pindar's victory odes. They read the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, who had written about the Games as if they were the most important events in the world, and they began to wonder, could the Games be brought back? Could the spirit of ancient Olympia be revived in the modern world? The answer came from an unlikely source, a French aristocrat who had never competed in athletics, who had no personal connection to ancient Greece, but who believed with absolute conviction that the Olympic Games could be a force for peace, unity, and human progress. His name was Pierre de Coubertin, and in 1896, in the shadow of the Acropolis in Athens, he would resurrect the Games that had been dead for 15 centuries. But the Olympics he created would be different from the ancient Games in almost every way. They would not be a religious festival. They would not be limited to Greeks. They would not be held in a rural sanctuary dedicated to Zeus. Instead, they would be a global event, a celebration of international cooperation and athletic excellence, a symbol of humanity's ability to come together in peace despite the divisions of language, culture, and politics. The ancient Games had been about honouring the gods. The modern games would be about honouring humanity itself. And in that transformation, the Olympics would become something even greater than they had been in antiquity. Not just a competition, but a movement, a vision of what the world could be if we chose to celebrate our shared humanity rather than our differences. But that story, the story of the modern Olympics, of their triumphs and their failures, of the heroes who competed and the forces that threatened to destroy them, that story is still unfolding. And it begins not in ancient Greece, but in the modern world, in a time of empires and revolutions, of nationalism and globalization, of hope and conflict. It begins with a dreamer who believed that the past could inspire the future, and it begins with a question: can the spirit of the ancient games survive in a world that has forgotten the gods? The ruins of Olympia lay buried beneath 20 feet of mud and sediment for over 1,000 years. The temples had crumbled, the stadium had vanished, the sacred olive tree had long since turned to dust. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment and then the Age of Romanticism, scholars and archaeologists became obsessed with the classical past. They travelled to Greece and Italy, excavating the ruins of ancient civilizations, uncovering statues, temples and inscriptions that had been lost for centuries. And in 1766, an English antiquarian named Richard Chandler rediscovered the site of Olympia. He found fragments of columns, pieces of sculpture, and inscriptions that confirmed what ancient texts had described. This was the place where the Olympic Games had been held. This was the sanctuary of Zeus. And in 1875, a team of German archaeologists led by Ernst Curtius began a systematic excavation of the site. Over the course of several years, they uncovered the Temple of Zeus, the Temple of Hera, the stadium, the gymnasium, and thousands of artifacts, bronze statues, victory inscriptions, athletic equipment, and offerings left by pilgrims. The ancient world was coming back to life, emerging from the earth like a memory that refused to be forgotten. At the same time, across Europe, there was a growing interest in physical education and athletic competition. Schools and universities began to emphasize sports as a way to build character, discipline, and national pride. Athletic clubs were founded, competitions were held, and some visionaries began to wonder if the Olympic Games, which had been the greatest athletic festival of the ancient world, could be revived for the modern age. The man who would make this dream a reality was a French aristocrat named Pierre de Coubertin. Born in 1863 into a wealthy and conservative family, Coubertin was educated at elite schools and seemed destined for a career in politics or the military. But he was not interested in either. He was interested in education, in the development of young people, and in the role that sports could play in building strong, healthy, and morally upright citizens. He travelled to England and was deeply impressed by the English public school system, which emphasised athletics as much as academics. He believed that France, which had been humiliated by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, needed to rebuild not just its military, but its national character. And he believed that sports, and specifically the revival of the Olympic Games, could be the key. Coubertin was not the first person to propose reviving the Olympics. There have been several small-scale attempts in Greece and England to hold Olympic competitions, but none of them had gained international recognition. Coubertin's vision was different. He did not want a local festival or a national competition. He wanted a truly international event, one that would bring together athletes from every nation on earth, regardless of politics, religion, or ideology. He believed that athletic competition could promote peace and understanding between nations, that it could transcend the divisions that led to war. In 1894, Coubertin organised an international congress in Paris, where he presented his proposal to representatives from 9 countries. He argued passionately for the revival of the Olympic Games, invoking the glory of ancient Greece and the ideals of fair play, excellence, and international cooperation. The delegates were convinced. They voted to establish the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, and to hold the first modern Olympic Games in Athens, Greece, in 1896. Coubertin's dream was becoming a reality. The first modern Olympic Games were held in April 1896 at the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens, a marble stadium that had been built in the 4th century BC and restored for the occasion. 280 athletes from 13 nations competed in 43 events, including track and field, gymnastics, swimming, cycling, fencing, shooting, tennis, and weightlifting. There were no team sports, no winter events, and no women. Coubertin, despite his progressive vision in many areas, believed that women's participation in sports was impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and improper. The games were modest by modern standards, but they were a success. The stadium was packed with spectators. The athletes competed with passion and skill. And the event that captured the imagination of the Greek people was the marathon, a race that had never been part of the ancient Olympics but was invented for the modern games to honour the legend of Pheidippides, the messenger who was said to have run from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens to announce victory over the Persians, and then collapsed and died. The marathon was won by a Greek shepherd named Spiridon Louis, who became a national hero overnight. His victory was seen as a symbolic reclaiming of Greece's ancient glory, a moment when the modern nation connected with its mythological past. The success of the Athens Games ensured that the Olympics would continue, but the early years were chaotic and inconsistent. The 1900 Paris Olympics were held as a sideshow to the World's Fair and lasted for 5 months, with events scattered across the city and little organisation. Many athletes did not even realise they were competing in the Olympics. The 1904 St. Louis Olympics were similarly disorganised, held alongside another World's Fair, and dominated by American athletes because few Europeans could afford to travel to the United States. But despite these challenges, the Games grew. More nations participated, more events were added, and in 1900 women competed for the first time. 22 women participated in tennis, golf, sailing and croquet. A British tennis player named Charlotte Cooper became the first individual female Olympic champion, winning the women's singles and mixed doubles. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually make the Olympics a truly inclusive event. By 1924, when the Games returned to Paris, the modern Olympics had found their identity. The Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius, faster, higher, stronger, was officially adopted. The Games grew to 3,000 athletes from 44 nations. The first Winter Olympics were held in Chamonix, France, adding skiing, ice hockey, and figure skating to the Olympic programme. The Games were becoming a global phenomenon, a celebration of human achievement that transcended national boundaries. But they were also becoming a stage for political conflict, a mirror reflecting the tensions and ideologies of the modern world. And nowhere was this more evident than in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which would become one of the most controversial and significant events in Olympic history. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933, and they saw the 1936 Olympics as an opportunity to showcase the supposed superiority of the Aryan race and the strength of the Third Reich. The Games were meticulously organised, with new stadiums, elaborate ceremonies, and propaganda films directed by Leni Riefenstahl that portrayed the Nazis as the heirs to ancient Greek civilization. Hitler attended the Games and used them to promote his ideology of racial purity and German nationalism. But his plans were shattered by a 22-year-old African-American track and field athlete named Jesse Owens. Owens, the son of sharecroppers and the grandson of slaves, had grown up in poverty in Alabama and Ohio. He had faced racism and discrimination his entire life. But he was also one of the greatest athletes the world had ever seen. At the Berlin Olympics, Owens won 4 gold medals in the 100 metres, the 200 metres, the long jump and the 4x100 metre relay. He set 3 Olympic records and tied another. His performances were so dominant so graceful, so undeniable, that they demolished the Nazi myth of Aryan superiority. Hitler, who had been congratulating German winners in person, stopped attending the medal ceremonies after Owens's victories, reportedly on the advice of Olympic officials who told him he must congratulate all winners or none. He chose none. The story that Hitler personally snubbed Owens by refusing to shake his hand is a myth, but the real snub came from Owens's own country. When he returned to the United States, he was not invited to the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was concerned about losing the support of Southern white voters, never acknowledged Owens's achievements. Only white American Olympians were invited to meet the president. Owens returned to a segregated America, where he could not eat in the same restaurants as white people, could not stay in the same hotels, could not use the same bathrooms. He was forced to take menial jobs to support his family, including racing against horses at county fairs for money. He later said, "Hitler didn't snub me. It was our president who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram." But despite the racism he faced, Owens's legacy endured. His victories in Berlin became a symbol of the triumph of human dignity over hatred, of excellence over ideology, and they proved that the Olympics, despite their flaws and contradictions, could be a stage for moments of profound moral and athletic significance. The Games had survived their first 40 years. They had grown from a modest gathering in Athens to a global spectacle watched by millions. But the greatest challenges were still ahead. The world was about to be plunged into the most devastating conflict in human history, and the Olympics would be forced to confront questions of politics, ideology, and survival that would test the very ideals on which they were founded. The Olympic Games were suspended during World War II. The 1940 Games, which were supposed to be held in Tokyo, were cancelled after Japan invaded China. The 1944 Games, scheduled for London, were cancelled as Europe burned. For 12 years, the Olympic flame was extinguished. But in 1948, the Games returned to London, held in a city still scarred by bombing, still rationing food, still rebuilding from the devastation of war. The athletes competed in makeshift facilities. There were no new stadiums, no grand ceremonies. But the Games went on, and they represented something powerful, the resilience of the human spirit, the belief that even after the worst horrors imaginable, humanity could still come together in peace and competition. The Olympics had survived the war, but they were about to enter a new and equally dangerous era, the Cold War, a period of ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that would turn the Games into a battlefield where nations fought not with weapons, but with athletes, medals, and propaganda. The Cold War Olympics were defined by boycotts, protests, and political manipulation. The Games became a proxy war, a way for superpowers to demonstrate their superiority without firing a shot. The Soviet Union entered the Olympics for the first time in 1952 and immediately began to dominate, using state-sponsored training programs to produce world-class athletes. The United States responded with its own programs, and the medal count became a measure of national pride and ideological supremacy. But the most dramatic moments of this era were not about medals. They were about protest, about athletes using the Olympic stage to make political statements that would echo around the world. The first of these moments came in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics, when two African-American sprinters named Tommy Smith and John Carlos stepped onto the podium after finishing first and third in the 200 meters. As the American national anthem played, they bowed their heads and raised black-gloved fists in the air. A silent, powerful protest against racial injustice in the United States. They wore no shoes, only black socks to represent black poverty. Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride. Carlos wore beads to honour black people who had been lynched. The Australian silver medalist Peter Norman wore a badge supporting the Olympic Project for Human Rights in solidarity with them. The image of Smith and Carlos on the podium, fists raised, became one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. But the immediate reaction was not celebration. It was condemnation. The International Olympic Committee, led by President Avery Brundage, expelled Smith and Carlos from the Olympic Village and banned them from future competition. They were vilified in the American press, called unpatriotic, disrespectful, and ungrateful. They received death threats. Their families were harassed. Peter Norman, who had supported them, was ostracised by the Australian Olympic Committee and never competed in the Olympics again, despite qualifying for the 1972 Games. Smith and Carlos returned to the United States to find their athletic careers over and their reputations destroyed. But over time, their protest came to be seen not as an act of disrespect, but as an act of courage, a moment when two athletes used their platform to speak truth to power, to demand justice, and to remind the world that the Olympics were not just about sport, but about the values we claim to uphold. In 2005, a statue of Smith and Carlos on the podium was erected at San Jose State University, where both men had been students. The statue shows them with their fist raised, but the silver medal position is left empty, an invitation for visitors to stand in Peter Norman's place and reflect on what it means to stand in solidarity with those who fight for justice. But if the 1968 Olympics were defined by protest, the 1972 Munich Olympics were defined by tragedy. On September 5th, 1972, 8 members of a Palestinian militant group called Black September stormed the Olympic Village in Munich, Germany. They broke into the apartment where the Israeli Olympic team was staying. 2 Israeli athletes, wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg and weightlifter Yosef Romano, fought back and were killed immediately. 9 others were taken hostage. The terrorists demanded the release of over 200 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails and safe passage out of Germany. The world watched in horror as the crisis unfolded on live television. Negotiations dragged on for hours. The German authorities, inexperienced in handling such situations, made a series of catastrophic mistakes. They agreed to provide the terrorists with helicopters to transport them and the hostages to a nearby airbase, where a plane would supposedly take them to an Arab country. But it was a trap. German police snipers were positioned at the airbase, and when the helicopters landed, they opened fire. The rescue attempt was a disaster. The terrorists threw grenades into the helicopters, killing the hostages. In the chaos, all 9 remaining Israeli athletes were killed, along with 5 of the 8 terrorists and 1 German police officer. The Games were suspended for 34 hours, the only time in modern Olympic history that competition has been halted. A memorial service was held in the Olympic Stadium, attended by 80,000 people. IOC President Avery Brundage gave a speech in which he controversially declared, "The Games must go on," and they did. But the Munich massacre changed the Olympics forever. It shattered the illusion that the Games could exist in a bubble, separate from the political conflicts of the world. It proved that the Olympics, precisely because they were a global stage watched by billions, were a target for those who wanted to make a political statement through violence. Security at future Olympics would be massively increased, turning the Games into heavily fortified events surrounded by armed guards, checkpoints and surveillance. The innocence of the early modern Olympics, the belief that sport could transcend politics, was gone. A BC sportscaster, Jim McKay, who had been covering the Games, delivered the news to American viewers with a simple, devastating sentence: "They're all gone." It became one of the most famous moments in broadcast history, a moment when the world realized that the Olympics, like everything else, were vulnerable to the darkness of human conflict. The political manipulation of the Olympics reached its peak in the 1980s, with 2 massive boycotts that nearly destroyed the Games. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, sparking international outrage. US President Jimmy Carter, seeking to punish the Soviets without going to war, decided to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics. He pressured American allies to join the boycott, and ultimately 65 nations refused to participate, including West Germany, Japan, China, and Canada. The boycott was a political gesture, but it accomplished nothing. The Soviet Union did not withdraw from Afghanistan. The war would continue for another decade, killing over 1 million people. The only people who were truly punished were the athletes, many of whom had trained their entire lives for the chance to compete in the Olympics, and were denied that opportunity for reasons beyond their control. The 1980 Moscow Olympics went ahead without the Americans, and the Soviet Union dominated, winning 80 gold medals, the most lopsided result in Olympic history. But the Games felt hollow, diminished by the absence of so many nations. 4 years later, the Soviet Union retaliated. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics were boycotted by the Soviet Union and 14 Eastern Bloc nations who claimed that the Games were being used for American propaganda and that their athletes would not be safe. It was a transparent act of revenge, and it left the Los Angeles Olympics without many of the world's best athletes. But the 1984 Games were significant for another reason. They mark the birth of the commercialized Olympics. The organising committee, led by Peter Ueberroth, funded the Games entirely through private sponsorships, television rights, and corporate partnerships, with no government funding. It was a radical experiment, and it worked. The Games turned a profit of $250 million, proving that the Olympics could be financially self-sustaining. But this success came at a cost. The Games became increasingly corporate, increasingly focused on profit and spectacle rather than athletic purity. Sponsors' logos appeared everywhere. Television networks paid billions for broadcasting rights and demanded scheduling changes to maximize viewership. The Olympics, which had been revived as a celebration of amateur athletics and international cooperation, were becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry. And as the money poured in, so did the temptations, the pressure to win at any cost, the incentive to cheat, and the willingness to sacrifice the health and well-being of athletes in pursuit of medals and glory. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the political boycotts ended with it. But the Olympics had been fundamentally changed by the conflicts of the 20th century. They were no longer a simple celebration of athletic excellence. They were a global spectacle, a corporate enterprise, a political stage, and a target for those who wanted to make a statement. The Games had survived war, terror, and boycotts, but they had lost something in the process, the purity of purpose that had defined them in their earliest years. And as the Olympics entered the 21st century, they would face new challenges: the rise of performance-enhancing drugs, the corruption of officials, the environmental and financial costs of hosting the Games, and the question of whether the Olympic ideal, the belief that sport can bring out the best in humanity, could survive in a world increasingly defined by cynicism, inequality, and division. But before we confront those questions, we must first meet the athletes who pushed the boundaries of human performance to levels that seemed impossible, who became legends not just for what they achieved, but for how they achieved it, and for the price they paid. By the late 20th century, the Olympics had become the ultimate test of human physical capability. Athletes were faster, stronger, and more skilled than ever before. World records that had stood for decades were being shattered. New techniques, new training methods, and new technologies were pushing the boundaries of what the human body could achieve, and a new generation of athletes emerged, men and women who seemed to transcend the limits of ordinary human performance, who dominated their sports so completely that they became legends in their own time. These were the superhuman athletes, the ones whose names would be remembered alongside the ancient champions of Olympia, the ones who proved that the Olympic ideal, the pursuit of excellence, the drive to be the best, was still alive. But their stories also revealed a darker truth, that the pursuit of greatness often comes at a terrible cost, and that the line between excellence and excess, between dedication and destruction, is thinner than we'd like to believe. The first of these modern legends was Michael Phelps, an American swimmer who would become the most decorated Olympian of all time. Phelps competed in 5 Olympic Games between 2000 and 2016, winning 28 medals, 23 of them gold. His dominance was so complete, so sustained, that it redefined what was possible in the sport of swimming. At the 2008 Beijing Olympics, Phelps won 8 gold medals in a single Games, breaking Mark Spitz's record of 7 gold set in 1972. 7 of those 8 victories set world records. He won some races by hundredths of a second, his fingertips touching the wall just before his competitors. He won others by body lengths, his lead so commanding that the outcome was never in doubt. Phelps's success was not just about talent, it was about obsession. He trained 6 hours a day, 7 days a week for years. He swam over 50 miles per week. He consumed 12,000 calories a day to fuel his body. He sacrificed everything, relationships, education, and normal life, for the chance to be the greatest. And he achieved it. But the cost was immense. After the 2012 London Olympics, where he won 4 more gold medals, Phelps fell into a deep depression. He struggled with alcohol abuse, was arrested for drunk driving, and contemplated suicide. He later said that he felt empty, that after spending his entire life chasing Olympic glory, he didn't know who he was without it. He eventually sought help, returned to competition, and won 5 more gold medals at the 2016 Rio Olympics before retiring for good. His story is one of triumph, but also of the psychological toll that the pursuit of greatness can exact. Then there was Usain Bolt, the Jamaican sprinter who became the fastest man in history. Bolt won 8 Olympic gold medals across 3 consecutive games, 2008, 2012 and 2016, dominating the 100 metres, 200 metres and 4x100 metre relay. He set world records that still stand, 9.58 seconds in the 100 metres and 19.19 seconds in the 200 metres. His performances were so dominant, so effortless, that they seemed almost superhuman. Bolt didn't just win, he made winning look easy. He celebrated before crossing the finish line, slowing down to beat his chest or point at the clock. His trademark lightning bolt pose became one of the most recognisable images in sports. But Bolt's dominance also raised questions. How could one man be so much faster than everyone else? Was it genetics, training, or something else? Bolt was never caught using performance-enhancing drugs, and he has always maintained that his success was natural. But his era was also marked by widespread doping scandals, and the shadow of suspicion hung over even the cleanest athletes. Bolt retired in 2017, his legacy secure, but the questions remain. And then there was Simone Biles, the American gymnast who redefined what was possible in her sport. Biles won 7 Olympic medals, including 4 golds, and performed moves so difficult that they were named after her. The Biles on floor exercise and vault, skills that no other gymnast in the world could replicate. She was so dominant that she won competitions even when she made mistakes. Her difficulty scores so high that her competitors couldn't catch her even with perfect routines. But at the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, something unexpected happened. Biles withdrew from multiple events, citing mental health concerns. She said she had lost her sense of spatial awareness in the air, a dangerous condition known as the twisties that could result in serious injury. Her decision sparked a global conversation about athlete well-being, about the pressure to perform, and about the cost of being the best. Some praised her for prioritising her health, others criticised her for quitting. But Biles's decision was a reminder that even the greatest athletes are human, that the pursuit of excellence can push people to their breaking point, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back. And in 2026, the world watched as Elise Alou, the young figure skater who had retired at 16, returned to the ice and won Olympic gold. Her story was different from Phelps, Bolt and Biles. She'd walked away from the sport not because of injury or scandal, but because she needed to find herself, to remember why she loved skating in the first place, and when she came back she did so on her own terms, without the pressure, without the expectations, skating not for medals or fame, but for the art itself. Her victory was a reminder that the Olympics, at their best, are not just about winning. They're about the journey, the struggle, the courage to pursue something greater than yourself. But for every story of triumph, there were stories of failure, of athletes who pushed too hard, who sacrificed too much, who crossed lines that should never be crossed. And nowhere was this more evident than in the epidemic of doping that plagued the Olympics in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The most infamous doping scandal in Olympic history occurred at the 1988 Seoul Olympics, when Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson won the 100 metres in a world record time of 9.79 seconds. Johnson was celebrated as the fastest man on Earth, a national hero, but 3 days later he tested positive for stanozolol, an anabolic steroid. His gold medal was stripped, his world record was erased, he was banned from competition for 2 years. Johnson later admitted that he had been using performance-enhancing drugs for years, and that many of his competitors were doing the same. His case exposed the widespread use of doping in track and field and led to increased testing and stricter penalties. But the problem did not go away. In fact, it got worse. By the 2000s, doping had become so sophisticated, so widespread, that it threatened the integrity of the entire Olympic movement. And the most shocking revelation came in 2016, when a Russian whistleblower named Grigory Rodchenkov exposed a state-sponsored doping program that had been operating for years. Rodchenkov was the director of Russia's anti-doping laboratory, and he revealed that Russian athletes across dozens of sports had been using performance-enhancing drugs with the full knowledge and support of the Russian government. The scheme was elaborate and brazen. During the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, which were held in Russia, FSB agents, Russian intelligence officers, swapped urine samples through a hidden hole in the wall of the testing laboratory, replacing dirty samples with clean ones. Over 1,000 Russian athletes were implicated. 118 were banned from the 2016 Rio Olympics. Russia was banned from competing under its own flag at the 2018 and 2020 Olympics, forced to compete as Olympic athletes from Russia with no national anthem or flag. The scandal was a devastating blow to the credibility of the Olympics, proof that even at the highest levels, the pursuit of victory could corrupt everything. And it raised a question that has haunted the Games ever since. If we cannot trust that the competition is fair, if we cannot trust that the athletes are clean, then what is the point of the Olympics at all? As the Olympics entered the third decade of the 21st century, they faced existential challenges. The cost of hosting the Games had become astronomical, often leaving cities with billions of dollars in debt and abandoned stadiums that served no purpose after the athletes left. Athens, which hosted the 2004 Olympics, was left with a financial burden that contributed to Greece's economic crisis. Rio de Janeiro, which hosted the 2016 Olympics, saw its Olympic venues fall into disrepair within months, with pools turning green, stadiums crumbling, and infrastructure projects left unfinished. The International Olympic Committee had been accused of corruption, with allegations that host cities were chosen through bribery and backroom deals. The environmental impact of the Games, the construction, the travel, the waste, was increasingly seen as unsustainable in an era of climate change, and the question of relevance loomed large. In an age of streaming, social media and esports, did the Olympics still matter? Did young people still care about watching athletes compete in sports they only paid attention to once every 4 years? The 2024 Paris Olympics attempted to address some of these concerns. The organisers emphasised sustainability, using existing venues rather than building new ones, and achieved gender parity for the first time, with equal numbers of male and female athletes. The Games were a success, drawing large audiences and producing memorable moments. But the fundamental questions remained. What is the purpose of the Olympics in the modern world? Are they a celebration of human excellence or a corporate spectacle? Are they a force for unity or a stage for political conflict? Are they worth the cost, financial, environmental, and human? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers. But perhaps the answer lies not in what the Olympics are, but in what they represent. Because despite all the corruption, all the scandals, all the politics and commercialization, the Olympics endure. Every 4 years, the world still pauses to watch. Athletes still train for years, sacrificing everything for the chance to compete. And in those moments of competition, when a runner crosses the finish line, when a gymnast sticks a landing, when a skater glides across the ice, we see something that transcends the flaws and failures of the institution. We see human beings pushing themselves to the absolute limit of what is possible. We see courage, determination, and grace. We see the same thing that the ancient Greeks saw when they gathered at Olympia over 2,000 years ago. The belief that we are capable of greatness, that we can be more than we are, that we can reach for something beyond ourselves. And that belief, more than any medal or record or ceremony, is what the Olympics are truly about. It is what has allowed them to survive for over a century in their modern form, and for over a millennium in their ancient form. It is what connects Elisa Liu skating in Milan to Coroebus running in Olympia. What connects Michael Phelps to Leonidas of Rhodes. What connects every athlete who has ever competed in the Olympic Games across the span of human history. They are all part of the same story. The story of humanity's endless quest to be better, to go faster, to reach higher, to prove that we are capable of achieving the impossible. And as long as that quest continues, as long as there are people willing to dedicate their lives to the pursuit of excellence, the Olympic Games will endure. They will change. They will adapt. They will face new challenges and new crises, but they will survive. Because the spirit that created them, the spirit of competition, of striving, of reaching for something greater, is as old as humanity itself, and it will never die, but legends do not die easily. And in 1896, in the shadow of the Acropolis in Athens, the Games were reborn. They were different now, no longer a religious festival, no longer limited to Greeks, no longer held in a rural sanctuary dedicated to Zeus. They were a global event, a celebration of international cooperation and human excellence, a symbol of what the world could be if we chose to come together in peace rather than conflict. The modern Olympics have survived 2 world wars, political boycotts, acts of terror, and scandals that threaten to destroy them. They have been a stage for heroes and a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest conflicts. They have been corrupted by politics, commercialized by corporations, and tainted by doping. But they have also produced moments of transcendent beauty and courage, moments when athletes pushed beyond the limits of what seemed possible, when ordinary people achieved extraordinary things, when the world paused to witness something greater than itself. From Coroebus the cook to Elisa Liu the skater, from Milo of Croton to Michael Phelps, from the sacred olive crowns of Olympia to the gold medals of the modern podium, the story remains the same. It is the story of human beings striving for something beyond survival, beyond comfort, beyond the ordinary limits of existence. It is the story of the belief that we are capable of greatness, that we can be more than we are, that we can reach for something transcendent. The ancient Greeks called this arete, excellence, virtue, the fulfillment of one's highest potential. And they believed that the pursuit of arete was the highest calling of human life, more important than wealth or power or even happiness. To compete at Olympia was to pursue arete in its purest form, to test yourself against the best, to push your body and spirit to their absolute limits, and to do so in the presence of the gods. The gods are gone now. The temples have crumbled. The sacred rituals have been replaced by corporate sponsorships and television broadcasts. But the essence remains. The Olympics are still about the pursuit of excellence. They are still about the belief that competition can bring out the best in us, that striving for greatness is a worthy goal, that the journey matters as much as the destination. And they are still about the moments, those brief, shining moments when an athlete achieves something that seems impossible, when time seems to stop, when the crowd holds its breath, and when we are reminded of what human beings are capable of when we refuse to accept our limitations. These moments are rare, they are fleeting, but they are real, and they are worth everything. The Olympics will continue to change. They will face new challenges, new crises, new questions about their purpose and their value. They will be criticised, reformed and reinvented, but they will endure. Because the need they fulfill, the need to compete, to strive, to prove ourselves, to reach for something greater, is as old as humanity itself. It is the same need that drove ancient Greeks to race barefoot in the dust of Olympia. It is the same need that drove Elisa Liu to return to the ice after walking away. It is the same need that will drive future generations of athletes to train, to sacrifice, to compete, long after we are gone. The story of the Olympics is not finished. It is still being written, and as long as there are people willing to push themselves to the limit, willing to risk everything for the chance to be the best, willing to believe that excellence is worth pursuing, the story will continue. From ancient temples to modern stadiums, the spirit of competition has travelled across centuries. The athletes have changed, the arenas have grown larger, but the story remains the same. Humanity striving for something greater than itself. And somewhere in that struggle, in that endless pursuit of excellence, in that refusal to accept the limits of what we are, the echoes of myth still remain. The gods may be gone, but the glory they promised is still within reach. And every 4 years, when the Olympic flame is lit, when athletes from every nation gather to compete, when the world pauses to watch, we are reminded that the ancient dream is still alive, the dream of immortality, the dream of greatness, the dream that we can be more than we are, and that dream, more than any medal or record or ceremony, is what the Olympics are truly about. It is what they have always been about, and it is what they will always be about as long as humanity endures,